Good morning and welcome to the Point. This Sunday morning, we sit down with Michigan's senior senator, Debbie Stabenow, to talk about what she's working on as she tours around the state during the congressional recess, traditionally in the month of August. We start by talking about nuclear waste disposal, and she says it's way too close to one of our natural resources. In the 20 plus years that I have been doing stories in this state, there isn't a year that goes by that we don't have somebody complain loudly about trash coming from Canada into Michigan. And we know that through NAFTA and other arrangements that is made possible. We're not here to rehash that at this moment. But this is, in my mind, somewhat analogous. They're not bringing radioactive material into the United States, but they're getting real close to a shared waterway. Tell me about Canada's, or at least a company in Canada's plan to bury this nuclear waste, what sounds dangerously close to the lake.
Very close to Lake Huron. And first let me say, I agree with you. We do all kinds of things with our friends. They are our friends in Canada on a daily basis. I was pleased on a voluntary basis a number of years ago to be able to get the municipal waste from the trash trucks stopped. The commercial waste is a different thing legally, and we weren't able to address that. But about 40,000 trucks have stopped coming across the bridges, which is good. Now we're in a situation where Canada is looking, and a private company wants to put 7 million tons of low and moderate nuclear waste, and they define that a little differently than we do, bury it down below the water table next to Lake Huron. And so far they viewed that as a Canadian only decision-making process. We've been trying to figure out, we've been writing letters, there have been resolutions done, and so I'm trying to get them to slow down or not to do it. I met with the Premier of Ontario, a terrific woman. We had a great conversation, but we're trying to figure out how do we make this a joint US-Canadian decision. And so with some great research on my staff's part, we found a boundary water treaty from 1909 that requires, if the State Department it asserts that there is a risk to water, that there has to be a process to jointly do studies and negotiate and have discussions, and in some cases actually require that things stop until there's agreement with the United States. So I have legislation that we'll be introducing in September to activate that treaty. There's a lot of land in Canada, just like in the United States. We don't have to see this right by the water. And for the life of me, I can't understand. Now, I also, to say in fairness, we have some radioactive waste at nuclear power plants that are temporarily, although they've been there too long, waste by the water, and that needs to be moved. But we're looking there 2,500, 2,700 tons. We're talking 7 million tons. And that's just the first round of what we're talking about. So we need to have a different kind of discussion with Canada where we have some say because of the joint jurisdiction and the risk to the Great Lakes.
When you think about it, and I'm certainly not a scientist or a geologist and don't pretend to be, but you pointed out something that I've often wondered about. There are millions of uninhabited acres in Canada, and while you make the point, we too have a lot of land, but I would suspect that on a per capita basis there's a whole lot more spare space in Canada than there is here. Has anybody given you any rationale other than, I assume, it's cost effective because it's nearer the facility?
Yeah, it's cost effective. I mean, it's cost effective, and it's near the facility, and they don't, the company's arguing it's below the water table, and it's, the formations of the rock and so on, that it makes it safe. But the reality is there's a lot of other land and a lot of other places, and if something did happen, heaven forbid, you're talking about a catastrophe in terms of the Great Lakes. I can't imagine why we would take the risk.
You have been very concerned about the Great Lakes on a lot of levels.
Yes.
We've talked a number of times going back, well over a decade. I think we were worried about lamprey eels and zebra mussels.
That's right.
And now it's Asian carp. And we've been talking about this for the better part of a half a dozen years anyway.
Right.
So I know that you have worked with the administration. They haven't worked as quickly as you would like for them to. The Corps of Engineers gave a bunch of recommendations. Where are we in that process? Because the Asian carp aren't waiting on the studies.
They are not waiting. And we've seen some progress, but we are not where we should be. The first bill I put in regarding studying all the options of ways the fish could get into the Great Lakes, good news is that we found out. The bad news is there's 19 different ways. So now the good news of that was that we found that there was an area we could move in pretty quickly, moving from Indiana across Ohio, Wabash to Wabash to, I'm drawing a blank here, on the river that, I'm drawing a blank right now, but into Lake Erie.
Okay.
Where they actually are putting up a barrier now in Indiana that will be able to stop the carp. So that's a good thing that we found that out. But then we asked the Army Corps, okay, tell us in the Chicago area, what's the best way to do this? They didn't give us one way, they gave us 8 ways. And so, and some very inexpensive, some taking 25 years and tens of billions of dollars. Okay, we've now boiled that down to basically a 2-step process, and the most promising thing, and the thing that we're trying to get done as quickly as possible, is to focus on a choke point 40 miles south of Chicago. It's called the Brandon Road Lock and Dam, where they've already got a couple of electric fences, but we're going to add a third one, and we want to add every kind of technology that you can think of. There's sound technology that's been proposed, light technology, I mean, just sort of all hands on deck at this place where Mississippi, Illinois rivers come together before they go into Chicago. It would take, instead of tens of billions, you could be looking at 6 or 8 million. So it's substantially less costly, could be done much more quickly. So now the question is, how do you get the Army Corps to move quickly on that? I met with the head of the Army Corps recently. We are pushing like crazy to get them to move because we have consensus on that. We don't have consensus with Chicago and Illinois about the longer term, but we do have consensus about that. And my theory is we throw everything at it, and then we have a new challenge in the Great Lakes called microbeads from cosmetics and so on, that that fish are eating these little tiny beads and it's killing the fish. And so I thought, okay, we'll have the Asian carp eat the microbeads. We'll blind them, we'll make them deaf through sound, and basically it's all hands on deck.
I got an interesting email, and it has been some weeks ago, and I did not reply to it because I anticipated we would be doing the show, although it's been longer than I thought, but it bears repeating, so I'll paraphrase the email. And we had done a story about Asian carp, and they said, well, what's the problem if a few Asian carp get into something as big as the Great Lakes? And no, again, no disrespect to the individual who wrote it.
Sure.
These fish multiply at a very rapid rate and have the ability to really change the ecosystem of the lake. Absolutely.
And you're talking about fish that can get up to 100 plus pounds and have no functioning stomach. They eat all the time. So it's not that they're eating the other fish necessarily, they're eating the fish food. They're eating the plankton, they're eating everything else the fish would be eating. And so, it's a threat to every other kind of fish. Then you add the fact that they respond to sound, and if you've seen those videotapes where they're jumping out of the water, imagine somebody is on a skidoo or somebody's water skiing, and we've seen this happen, where the fish will jump out and knock somebody out. In another case, broke somebody's nose. And so imagine tourism, all our beautiful Lake Michigan boating going on, and all of a sudden you can't swim, you can't water ski, you can't be out in a fishing boat without being worried about these fish jumping out of the water and knocking you out. So it's actually a very serious issue.
When these things come up, you're always quick to get back to us, and I know you will. We've got a couple minutes left in the show, and I want to ask you about something that is a little off the beaten path, but I couldn't help but think about, well, 2 things actually.
Sure.
First, you mentioned something about roads and needing a comprehensive strategy for transportation in Washington and one here in Michigan. If I'm not mistaken, the last time there was a major initiative here in Michigan, you were in the state Senate. Were you not when that passed? Were you in '97?
Yeah. Well, no, actually,
oh, that's
no.
you already in the House.
I was in the U.S.
But
House.
when you were in state government, did you recognize this? Did your class recognize this as a burgeoning problem out there? Is this something we've been dealing with in Michigan for decades and not just the last 10 years?
I would say that if there'd been cost of living increases put on, the ways we've funded roads, that would certainly have made a difference. Although at the time I was there, and I feel like really dating myself in the State House in the 80s and the early 90s in the State Senate, these were not big partisan issues. I mean, people saw them as problems to solve and really came together and may argue about the funding mechanism. But there wasn't the kind of thing that we're seeing today, or the idea that we should take money from education or for someplace else to fund roads. I mean, people were trying to figure out how to fund roads and bridges, and we always came up with something. I mean, it was always within the realm of transportation. And so this is the first time I've seen it, both in Lansing and in Washington, get to the point where, we're not just rolling up our sleeves and saying, this is a basic here. We've just got to solve it.
And finally, I'm going to finish where we started from. And I'm not trying to draw you into presidential politics, but I want your perspective on something. No, I'm not. I'm really not. I will later, but we're too far out, quite frankly, right now. What is it like to walk into the chamber being in the minority? I don't mean being in a Republican-Democrat minority, but most of your colleagues are running for president.
I know.
But I mean, there are what, half a dozen at least?
Several, yeah.
I mean, does that come into the chamber? It would be hard to keep it out.
Yeah, well, it comes in a couple of ways. First of all, everything is much more politically charged and partisan, and even differences between the Republicans. I mean, trying to stake out their views, and so on. So you see this dynamic going on the Republican side of people, trying to be opposite each other, and then the other one that you wouldn't think of necessarily is the schedule. These are folks that they want the session to be done so they can be out campaigning, and so you see this effort all the time of folks, that ought to be there, ought to be going to committee meetings, they ought to be voting, they should be there.
But there's a hog roast in Iowa,
but they're not there. And so that raises a whole nother set of issues.
Senator Debbie Stabenow has talked a lot about making sure the Great Lakes stay just that, great and clean. We'll have more of our conversation with the senator next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. We're talking with U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow, the senior senator from Michigan, as she travels around the state during this August recess. She's talking about the things she's working on in Washington, and a lot of them center around our environment and the Great Lakes. Senator, let's talk about the first 6 months in Washington, or a little more than six months, but a big election cycle last year, and it seems we didn't even get to take a breath, and we're already in the middle of another election cycle, which is a story for another day. But let's talk about what you in the United States Senate have or have not accomplished since you've gone back to work in January.
Yeah, well, it's been a very frustrating time. Now, on the positive side, I have to say that after getting the Farm Bill done, I've been spending a lot of time on implementation of the Farm Bill, which is very positive for us, and in West Michigan, having crop insurance available to help manage risk and the new conservation programs that help the Great Lakes. So that's all positive. But we went right into a time when Ted Cruz and others tried to hold up funding Department of Homeland Security because of disagreements with the president and shut down that funding, and it's just been a very cantankerous time. We have gotten a few things done that I would call, honestly, filibuster cleanup, because there are things that could have gotten done last year, like the Medicare doctor payment fix, which needed to get done, but it got held up last year in filibusters. So it's a frustrating time. I think the biggest thing for me is the fact that we don't have a long-term transportation bill. We focus on that in terms of Lansing, with the very same debate is going on in Washington about whether or not to have long-term funding on something that's so important to jobs and infrastructure. And so once again, the can got kicked down the road to the end of October. You can't fund transportation 5 minutes at a time or 5 miles at a time. I mean, we need long-term. And so that's a big frustration of mine. And then we also have not seen a focus on a bipartisan agreement on funding the federal government that's really balanced. And so, you know, I try to stay positive and stay focused and build bipartisan coalitions, but overall, a lot of just the same stuff that's been going on.
I want to go back a little bit. I want to talk. You've got a lot of initiatives going on, and there's some other issues that we need to talk about. But as I was sitting here thinking, you know, you talked about the reauthorization of the Farm Bill, and it wasn't just that you and your Republican colleagues were able to get that reauthorized. It was the only major reauthorization of the year.
Right.
And I know we've talked about it before, but I think it's well to point out that you and Senator Roberts, I believe, were able to work together to make that happen and get your colleagues to go along. And I get it, agriculture isn't always the most controversial thing, but it is a big line item issue.
Yeah.
And it does have some critics, particularly when it comes to nutrition programs and how people believe that money should be spent. How did you get there with all of this other stuff not happening?
Well, it's about relationships. It's about not demonizing the other person and trying to put them in a corner and punch them in the face. You know, it's very much about respecting other people's opinions, trying to find out what's important to them, and as much as you can, helping them accomplish their goals for their state while you're accomplishing the goals for your state and for the country. And it's very much about saying, you know, in a democracy, unless you can, if you can be the dictator, if I could be the dictator, great. But if I can't be, then I'll take democracy. And to do that, you have to be able to compromise and find common ground. And when I think about sitting in Grand Rapids and all that President Ford said about that, you know, coming together doesn't mean capitulating. When you compromise, you know, it's about working together. That's what's missing right now. We don't have enough people that are willing to acknowledge they may disagree on a particular topic, but it doesn't mean somebody's a bad person. It just means they have a different idea. And in the end, the public expects us to figure it out and to get things done. And that's what we should be doing.
One of the issues that we have heard or seen demonstrated some of that same division is the deal that the President and the Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry, President Obama, negotiated with Iran on the continuation of whatever nuclear development that has been going on there. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this for a couple of reasons. One is it is immensely complex. It is also pretty polarizing. But I want to ask you first where you think this is in the Senate, given particularly that a pretty significant member, Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, says he is not going to vote in favor of a bill that was negotiated by a president who he has worked with relatively closely.
Well, Chuck Schumer is a great friend of mine and a close ally. He represents a very large constituency that is deeply concerned about this and has to make his choice in terms of what he believes, you know, is the right thing to do, just like I do, just like all of us have to do on major decisions on foreign policy. And so I'm taking a deep dive into this. There are actually what we call a P5+1, 5 other countries involved. I've called the people that have been in negotiating, the ambassadors for each country, and talked to them personally, as well as being in meetings with them, as well as people on both sides here in Michigan. A lot of consensus around one thing, which is you can't trust Iran, and they are the largest state sponsor of terror, certainly in the region, and I would argue in the world. The question is, how do we make sure that they aren't even more dangerous by having a nuclear bomb? And one of the frightening things to look at is the fact that it is estimated, and everyone agrees, are about 3 months away from having that right now. And so the question is, how do we do this in a way that's safe for us in America, that's safe for Israel and our other allies and the region? I think good people can have different views on that, but I'm sorting through it based on the facts and what I believe is the right thing to do for us.
And you were very candid when we sat down. You said you are going to come to a decision, and perhaps before this airs. So if that has been announced, we'll obviously include that in this program. Do you feel like, and I'm not asking you to look into a crystal ball, but do you feel like the Senate is overall going to support the effort of the president? Because I know over in the House it could be a different issue.
Well, I think that I would say that the president will have a veto is upheld, I would say, probably in the House and the Senate. Now, I do think, in addition to very legitimate concerns about this, there's way too much partisanship, I believe, involved as well. But when you sort through all of that, I do think that in the end there will be enough members that will vote not to override a veto if the president does have a veto. I think there are important. I could argue this either way, honestly. It depends on sort of your perspective on whether overall this is a good deal, whether overall it's a bad deal. I think there are arguments on either side, and that's really what I'm sorting through right now.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Back in, I believe it was earlier this year, in January perhaps, we were down in St. Joseph and you were talking about some new conservation programs and ways to protect both the agriculture industry and clean waterways.
Right.
And now that we're in production season, talk a little bit about that. You were there with Senator Peters.
Right.
And
Senator Donnelly.
Oh, that's
from
right,
Indiana.
from Indiana.
Yeah.
And you were talking a little bit about something contained within, I believe within the Farm Bill that made it possible now for farmers to work with local agencies to come up with some best practices to keep some of the stuff that's really good for farming that's not so good for the water out of the water.
Right, exactly. And this is a new, what we call regional conservation partnership that we've set up through the Farm Bill. And it's really a new way of thinking about conserving land and water by having local people get involved in determining the best way to solve problems, whether it's the St. Joseph watershed, whether it's Saginaw, whether it's Lake Erie, and so on. And it's a matching funds. We're actually in total bringing in $40 million to do these efforts in Michigan, that were coupled with another $40 million from the private sector. So it's an $80 million effort, the largest effort in the country in terms of dollars coming in. But the idea is to work with our farmers who care deeply about our land and our water to develop the best strategies to keep topsoil on the land, to keep pesticides where they're supposed to be. I mean, pesticides are expensive. Nobody wants to put them on and have them run off into the water. To manage manure operations and all of these things that involve ways to stop runoff and sedimentation from going in the rivers. At St. Joe, the more sediment that goes in, the more you have to dredge, the more it costs to dredge. And so it's an economic development issue, it's water quality, it's support for our farmers, it's cost effective, and we're really focused in this 5-year Farm Bill on a different kind of strategy that's more about partnerships, and I really believe it'll be more effective.
We both come from a farm background. We understand that the farmers can be a pretty independent lot.
Right.
And this was interesting to me from this standpoint. This is not Washington saying this is what you're going to do.
Right.
This is Washington saying that you work within your local jurisdictions where you know your property, where you know your area, where you know your waterways, and you come up with X amount of dollars and we'll match those dollars. So that in itself is a different approach.
It really is. And when you think about cooperative extension and all of the local efforts that go on today, to be able to put all that together and to be able to say to farmers and agribusiness and local units of government, the townships, the cities and so on, communities, local conservation groups, environmental groups, it's really everybody coming in together. And we're saying, look, we know what the problems are in the big picture. You tell us what's the best way to solve them. And if it makes sense, we'll partner with you to do it.
Of course, there's a lot more going on in Washington. We'll continue to stay in touch with Senator Stabenow and all of our representatives. And there's quite a bit going on right here in the state of Michigan, too. We'll talk more about that next. To the Point. This week, we have seen even more developments in that startling revelation about 2 state representatives who apparently engaged in an illicit affair and then used some bizarre methods to try to cover it up. Now, there are calls for both Representative Cindy Gamarad and Representative Todd Corser to resign. So far, they have resisted. More official proceedings could be coming, and we'll be following that as you join us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.